In this segment, I'm going to take a look at the Applique tool, and that's found here on the left-hand side of your workspace on the Designing toolbar. Now, the Applique tool has a flyout, and there's actually two options. You've got the Applique tool, and then you have a partial applique, and I'll show how to use both of these two applique options. So basically, I'm going to choose the Applique tool, and before I draw myself an applique, I think I'll just go Control A to select everything on my screen, and Delete to clean up my desktop. And let's see, where's my embroidery hoop? See, it's way over there, so why don't we center myself in the hoop? Sure. Now, turn on the Applique tool, and go ahead and draw the applique shape. And just like any other time you're digitizing, if I left click, I get corner points. If I right click, I get those rounded points. Now an applique is going to be a closed shape, and so when I hit enter, the software will connect from my last point to my first point. So I'll go ahead and hit enter, and it asks me to enter point 1 on boundary 2. So if you wanted to have an applique that had an inner shape within it, you could draw that now. And if you don't need to have an inner shape on your applique, you simply hit enter a second time, and it completes the object and fills it in with red. So now I want to study a little bit more about the Applique tool and how it works. And the first thing I'm going to do is just simply zoom in really closely over the satin column. And what you can see here is there is the cutaway line for my applique. And then this is a zigzag tack down, and then of course this would be a finishing satin stitch border. Now if you'll notice here in the Resequence tab that this is what the object looked like, but if I actually switch right now to view my design by colors, you'll see that this applique has actually generated 3 different colors: pink, purple, and red. And that's not because I want you to stop and change the color of your thread. That it's a color change is what activates your sewing machine to stop. So in other words, you could sew all 3 colors in the same color of thread, but the first color change is for where you would trim the applique fabric on the outer edge of this. The second color changes for the zigzag tack down, and after the zigzag tack down, it comes along and finishes your shape with a satin edge. Now, if I take a zoom out on this object a little bit, oops, escape, you'll notice that this embroidery jumps over to this space here, and that's so that when you're digitizing when you're sewing an applique, and after that first step, which is the run stitch that you need to trim the fabric on the outer edge of that, the machine will actually finish that pink, and it jumps off to here, and it sits and waits for you to do the trimming. And the reason it moves off to here is whenever your machine moves backwards like this, it actually moves the hoop and the embroidery forwards away from the head of the sewing machine, and it makes it easier for you to get at your hands in and actually access the applique area. Now, if I select this application and then choose reshape, you'll notice that I can actually move this. We call it the jump off point, and I can move the jump off point to be any place that I would like it to be. So you can choose where your jump off point will be with this little, looks like an arrow inside of a circle. You also have the ability to adjust the exit point and the entry point for your embroidery for this object. So if you wanted it to start sewing here and finish sewing, over here, then you can do that. Sorry, I gotta just zoom in on that again. Lost my exit point when my screen nudged over on me. And so that's how you can reshape an applique. And of course you can move the points of the applique, add new points for the applique. But you can also choose to have the applique properties. So let's look at the object properties of this applique. So like I said before, whenever you choose a different tool, you get different object properties. And in this case, the object properties for the applique are in the Applique tab. So this is your options for an applique. You've got, first of all, there's the cover stitch. And so with the cover stitch, right now it's set as a satin fill, and I could adjust the density of my satin fill with this slider here. I can adjust the width of the satin fill by typing in the number here. And then I have the ability to offset the satin fill towards the inside or towards the outside. And then in this case, we've got 30% of our satin fill over the inside of the shape and 70% over the outside of the shape. And that's something that's very helpful when you're working with applique, because it really depends on the applique fabric where you want your satin edge to cover it. If you have really thick fabric, you're going to want more of your satin edge towards the outside of the shape to ensure that it covers all of the fabric that you've trimmed. But if you're using very lightweight and very delicate fabric for your applique, you may want to offset your satin column more towards the inside just to make sure that that the fabric is always covered by the satin edge and it doesn't want to pull away from that satin border. So that's your ability to adjust that setting. Now, if I change this satin fill to be, let's say, a blanket edge, instead of adjusting my satin density here, I get to set the spacing of my blanket edge here. And I still have a width for the blanket edge, but it now puts 100% of the stitch to the inside. And I'm just going to say OK for a minute so you can see the difference. You see, that's a very different type of applique, the blanket edge versus the satin column for the applique cover stitch. So you have two choices. It's either blanket or satin fill for your cover stitch on your applique. Now, another setting in your applique object details is the applique style itself. And you have two choices. It's either pre-cut or trim in place. Now, with a pre-cut applique, it requires the user to actually create a template and pre-cut out the applique shape. And in this case, when that pink line sews, it's actually a placement line to show you where to put your pre-cut piece of applique. And then after that, we'll sew the purple, which is the tack down, which is meant to quickly step inside and outside of your applique fabric to secure it to your base piece of fabric. So the opposite of pre-cut applique is a trim in place applique, and the trim in place applique will have one additional step, and that step will be where you actually stop. You place your applique fabric over top of the base material, and then it will sew a run stitch line, which then becomes your cut out line. And I'm just going to go ahead and make this change from pre-cut to trim in place and say OK. And so now you'll notice that we have a 4-color applique instead of a 3-color applique. So the first color, the pink, becomes a placement line. So you would stitch that placement line and it would show you where within your embroidery hoop you would place your applique fabric. So you would, after the machine stopped from the first color, you would place your applique fabric over top of this shape, and when you push start, it would sew the second color, which would be a duplicate of the first color. It's just another run stitch that sews around your applique fabric. Now when the machine stops, you get in there with your scissors and you trim away all of the excess fabric that would be around the outside of your shape, just leaving fabric on the inside of the shape. And then when you push start, it does the zigzag tack down, and then after all of that, it finishes the whole shape off with the satin stitch border. And so if I take a good close look here, you can see here where the green line is exactly the same place as where that pink line is. Now, something else about using an applique is, and again, if I just open up the object properties for the applique tab, you can actually show fabric inside of the applique on your desktop. So right now it's set to none. If I choose custom and I browse, it gives me the ability to browse through a list of fabrics, which I would then go ahead and select one, and I'll just browse through to show you some of the list, and it's quite a large list of fabrics. So if I choose blue felt for my applique fabric and say open, and then say OK, it emulates the idea that I've got a piece of fabric inside of this shape. And if you remember, we had the on/off key on our toolbar at the top to display or not to display applique fabric. So that's the applique tool and how you can first of all create an object. So with the applique tool, you simply draw the shape, and when you're done drawing the shape, you hit enter twice, it fills it in with thread, and then you have all the ability to adjust that shape within your applique tab. And so your choices of blanket fill or satin fill for the upper edge, you got the pre-cut or the trim in place options, and then you can have fabric shown in the background. And if I choose the factory fabrics and then just choose basically a color, so orange Ida cloth, and say okay, and it looks like that. One more thing about applique that I didn't show, and that was the tool had the flyout for having a partial applique. And what that means is, maybe what I'll do is I'm just going to clean up these two objects. Control A, oops, Control A, and delete. So what if I create an applique, two applique shapes that overlap each other? And so, for example, I'm going to go ahead and draw a triangle. So there's my triangle applique. And now I'm going to go ahead and draw a square, or whatever rectangular shape. So here we have two appliques, and they overlap each other. And if you were to sew these two out, the satin edge that was on the triangle, where it's underneath this square, may cause a bit of a lump. You may be able to feel that extra stitching in the satin edge underneath this square's applique fabric, and it's not needed. And that's where we have the ability to adjust the stitches in this area here. Now, what I'm going to do is show you how to do that. So first of all, you need to select both objects, and the easiest way to select both would be to drag a box around them both. Now I have two applique objects selected, and they have an overlap in between them. And now if I click on the applique tool and I fly it open, you'll see that now the option for partial applique becomes available. And if I click on that, it recognizes that the triangle is behind the square, and it removes the satin edge on the stitches where the triangle is behind that square, and it leaves the other important stitches. So you can see that my triangle still has the run stitch placement line for these are both pre-cut appliques. It still has the zigzag tack down around that area. It just simply removed the satin edge that is no longer needed in this area. So that's called a partial applique, and that's your ability to create two appliques that overlap and have the software remove some of the stitching on the inside of those two objects. So yeah, that's how to use the applique tool.